Stop me if you've heard this before. A brand new storyline for the original Yu-Gi-Oh series that was not written by Kazuki Takahashi. It takes place in between the Battle City and the King's Memories arc, and has Yugi and friends take on an all-new teal-haired villain. He initiates a hostile takeover of Kaiba Corp by controlling the dual disc holo technology to his will, and armed with that and his mysterious cards that rival the god cards in terms of power and destruction, sets his sights on Yugi. He kidnaps the soul of one of Yugi's closest friends and challenges him to confront him face to face, where he plans to enact his real plan. An unholy revival combining magic and technology, using Yugi's own despair as fuel. It's up to Yugi, Jonochi, and Kaiba to duel their way to the top against the villain's professional dueling mercenaries, and stop this madness before it's too late. High-stakes duels, deep introspection by Yugi, and even a highly anticipated rematch from Duelist Kingdom await this forgotten but exciting story. Do you already know what I'm talking about? Of course you do! I'm referring to Yu-Gi-Oh! R, of course. What? Were you expecting something else? Yu-Gi-Oh! R is the very first spin-off to the Yu-Gi-Oh! Franchise. Publishing just a month after the original series concluded, R was written by Akira Ito, an assistant to Kazuki Takahashi at the time, and tells an all-new original story for the manga. Seeing as how Takahashi was still involved with the spin-off, I feel like this is the final piece of the Yu-Gi-Oh! Manga puzzle that I feel is worth covering. While Yu-Gi-Oh! R isn't really canon, its placement in the timeline doesn't do it any harm, and I think it deserves some recognition. I mean, if the original manga is underrepresented on YouTube, then R is practically a mystery amongst most Yu-Gi-Oh! fans. So, let's see if R is a spin-off that's worth remembering, or if it was better off forgotten. Taking place after the Battle City arc, but right before the Memory World arc, R is the story of Yako Tenma, one of many orphans raised and adopted by Pegasus. Yako is out for revenge against Yugi after Yugi beat Pegasus and seemingly killed him at the end of Duelist Kingdom. Oh yeah, Pegasus is dead in the original manga, just so you know. Yako is concerned with two things. One is the revival of the man who took him in and gave him purpose, and two is to inflict as much despair and agony to Yugi as possible. He does this by initiating a hostile takeover of Kaiba Corp while Kaiba was overseas to take full control of Kaiba Corp's holo technology, and by wielding the Wicked Gods, evil gods literally designed to counter the Egyptian god cards present in Battle City. With the Wicked Gods in hand, Yako kidnaps Anzu, where he plans to use her soul as a sacrifice for Project RA. A blasphemous mixture of magic and technology using the Wicked Gods and Kaiba Corp's holo technology, all in an effort to revive Pegasus. It's up to Yugi, Jonochi, and eventually Kaiba to stop Yako and end his unholy gambit to revive his master. But stopping the three are the card professors, dueling mercenaries from America, all hired by Yako, who's put a $100,000 bounty on Yugi. And by the way, all this is introduced in like the first 3 chapters. Yeah, R doesn't waste any time in getting right into the action, which I think is one of its biggest strengths, but also one of its biggest weaknesses, but I'll get to that a little bit later. Despite the high stakes and game of death style structure where Yugi has to climb up a tower facing duelists on each floor, what I find to be the most interesting about Yu-Gi-Oh! R's story is its underlying theme of power creep. Multiple times throughout the manga, characters will point out that the strategies that Yugi and Kaiba used to achieve victory before are now being studied and countered by those who wish to beat them. At one point, Kaiba's precious Blue Eyes White Dragon, which was originally one of the most powerful monsters in the entire game, is mocked by one of his opponents as nothing more than a 3000 attack point beat stick with no effects. Even Dark Merrick's one-turn kill strategy of using Monster Reborn in conjunction with the Sun Dragon Ra, which was chronologically shown off just a few weeks ago and was such an unfair but brilliant combo, has already been figured out and countered by Yako Tenma. I find this really cool to see. You don't really ever get to a point in a Yu-Gi-Oh series where the opponents finally start catching on to the main characters' strategies and start countering them with their own more powerful cards. It's a great message, not just to the main characters, but also to those that play the card game in real life, that you don't own your strategies. Card combos and techniques that are seen as game-changing will eventually turn into common knowledge as the strategies and meta develops. But on the flip side, that just means that top players like Yugi and Kaiba get to show off and prove to those card professors just why they're at the top of the mountain. It's because they adapt and evolve just as the card game does. Overall, R's plot is decent enough to fulfill its purpose, and that's to get the main characters to duel against interesting decks and villains. While it might seem incredibly basic, it's ultimately harmless, and I found it to be a very fun story. And hey, the fact that R is nothing more than a side story means there's no opportunity to ruin anything. Really, if I had one major issue with R's plot, it's that Bakura, and more specifically Dark Bakura, is completely absent from the story, and I find that to be an utterly wasted opportunity. Dark Bakura is, after all, the guy who actually killed Pegasus, so the fact that Pegasus' killer never shows up once in a story about Pegasus being revived feels like a major missed opportunity. Now remember when I said that R's theme was about the growing power creep that has started to affect the card game? I feel like no character better embodies that than with R's main villain, Yako Tenma. I think Yako is one of the most underrated villains in the franchise, just because of how different he is. Yako isn't a master manipulator who controls each step the heroes make, nor is he a raving madman who's out to kill you while you're dueling him. No, deep down, Yako is just a man with a massive inferiority complex. You see, Yako is the younger twin brother of Gecko Tenma, a man so good at gaming he was straight up called the perfect duelist by Pegasus. Meanwhile, Yako is ostracized as the inferior twin by his own adopted family, which takes a massive toll on his mental state. Combine that with Pegasus' death and the corrupting effects of the Wicked God cards, and it creates a highly unstable villain teetering on the edge, who's somehow both in total control of what's going on, but is also about one step away from fucking losing it. But while Yako is an interesting villain, the one character everyone talks about whenever a discussion about Yu-Gi-Oh! R is brought up is Bandit Keith. Now, if you would recall, the last time we saw Bandit Keith, his brains were splattered all over Pegasus' carpet. So, it's a bit of a surprise to see him alive and well. Well, I wouldn't call his current state well. Thanks to the power of the Wicked Gods, Yako is able to revive Bandit Keith and asks him to pinpoint the murderer of Pegasus. Keith, being Keith, pins the blame entirely on Yugi, even though Keith was, too busy being dead to actually know this. You could make the argument that Keith is the real villain here, as him blaming Yugi for Pegasus' death is what really kickstarts Yu-Gi-Oh! R's story and incites Yako's revenge plot. Now, Bandit Keith is a character that I stupidly forgot to mention back in my original video on Yu-Gi-Oh's manga. More of a dueling hyena than he is a man, Keith is a very definition of a dirty coward. He may look intimidating, but behind his stature is a greedy, selfish bastard who's willing to sell anybody out if it means accomplishing his petty goals of revenge. If you want to know more about Keith in much greater detail, then I highly recommend Play on Channel 30's 40-minute, yes, 40-minute analysis on Keith's motives and machinations. Now that's the kind of Yu-Gi-Oh! Content I love to see. One thing that I do want to add about Keith, and what makes him such a good villain, especially in Yu-Gi-Oh!, is that in a series that's all about friendships and the bonds we make along our journey, Keith is a man with no bonds, no attachments, and no friends. Everyone in Yu-Gi-Oh! Has someone they fight for. Yes, even the villains like Pegasus and Merrick. Even Dark Bakura, for as vile and twisted as he is, had a connection to his village that was slaughtered right in front of his eyes, and part of his motive is to get revenge towards the Pharaoh over this. But Keith only duels for himself. He's motivated by pure selfish revenge, and what's great is that we see just how toxic of a mindset that is. When all you care about is yourself, it leads to this never-ending feeling of paranoia. Combine that with his unnatural revival, and Keith is more of a zombie fueled by rage than he is a man at this point. He's a fantastic villain for both Yugi and especially Jonouchi, but I'll get to that point a little bit later. But while Yako is interesting and Keith is an absolute delight, the rest of the villains are unfortunately very underwhelming. The card professors that Yako hires to hunt down Yugi sound interesting at first, but then you realize that most of them are just fodder for both Yugi and Jonouchi to duel against. The problem here is that there's 12 of them, and in a 5-volume manga, that's simply not enough time for them to leave any sort of lasting impression. Hell, one of them doesn't even get the opportunity to duel, because by the time he's introduced, the story is nearing its conclusion, and even Yugi is getting sick of dueling these guys, and just blasts him with one of the god cards. Which is a shame, because some of them have really cool designs and personalities that I'd like to know more about. Particularly Reiko, a duelist that Jonouchi faces that's only been playing for a month, but is already considered a prodigy, and Richie, another one of Pegasus's adopted children, and the one card professor neither Yugi nor Jonouchi actually dueled against. Speaking of the two, I've already gone over Yugi, Jonouchi, and Kaiba more extensively back in my original video about the manga, and one thing that R does really well is keep their characters in check and consistent. Dark Yugi is still a badass, watching Jonouchi duel is always fun, and Kaiba still leaks aura from just about any scene he's in. Name me any other CEO whose response to their company being taken over is to jump out of their planes to stand on top of it while it's still flying so that they can summon their personal dragon and use it to take back their company. It's also really cool to actually have an arc where Dark Yugi has all 3 god cards in his arsenal and uses them on a semi-regular basis. Usually they get taken away from him at the start of the arc because the writers don't want to find a way to include them in with his normal deck. However, special mention should go to regular Yugi and Jonouchi. For Jonouchi, once again, this is another chapter in his quest to become a better duelist. This time he's reaching a point where he's the one that's starting to become the veteran, and this can be seen in his duel with Reiko. It's really interesting seeing Jonouchi be in the experienced duelist position for a change, as he has to somehow reconcile beating Reiko while also trying to show her why dueling is so much fun. As for plain old Yugi, I really like that the manga gets to showcase him dueling on his own with Dark Yugi by his side. Yako is one of the few villains that has more of a connection with Yugi than the Pharaoh, which is something even Yako points out in their duel. It's another step to his growth in forging his own path as a duelist without always relying on Dark Yugi to duel for him. As for the duels themselves, what can I say? They are fast as hell. Turns go by very quickly, and Ito does a really good job at showcasing how much fun it is to read the duels and see all the traps, spells, and monster effects interact with one another. Especially now that the card game and its rules have been much more refined. This leads into a very brisk pace. Perhaps a bit too brisk. This is where my biggest problem with R lies. Yu-Gi-Oh! R is simply too short for what it's trying to do. There's over 15 duels, half of them lasting for a single chapter. R is only 5 volumes long. That's simply too many duels with not enough time for about 80% of them. The problem is the sheer amount of card professors the protagonists have to duel. I mean seriously, 12 of them? No wonder by the end Dark Yugi is sick of dueling them. R could easily be improved if the number of card professors was simply cut in half. That way the duels could have gone on longer and we could have known more about each opponent that our main characters face. I actually heard somewhere that the reason why there's 12 card professors is because it's a reference to Jesus' 12 disciples. I'm just gonna let that one sink in and just assume that's true, knowing how much Japanese media loves using religious imagery and symbolism, including Yu-Gi-Oh! Itself. But even so, I much prefer having a few quality duels than a bunch of rushed ones. A good example is the Memory World arc. Even though there's only 2 proper duels, they both are very important not just in terms of story, but also for the characters. Still, that does not mean ours without its quality duels. The highlight, of course, is the rematch between Bandit Keith and Jonouchi. Like I said earlier, Keith is a perfect foil for Jonouchi. Jonouchi is an up-and-coming duelist who improves his strategies and plays with each duel we see, thanks to the strength of his bonds with his friends. Keith is a man past his prime, bitterly clinging on thanks to his rage and despair. The themes of the card game evolving show up here, with Keith, who tries to win with his old tricks, but realizes that the game has evolved past him. This only fuels his anger and even affects how he physically looks. Where he was once tall and imposing, his body has gone thinner and lankier. But Jonouchi? He's well on his way to becoming a top duelist, and best of all, he's both motivated by himself to become a better player, and also by his friends, thanks to the bonds he's created, not just by his friends, but also from the duelists he faced. It's a classic battle between hope and despair, and best of all, Keith holds in his deck a God card, meaning in addition to facing off against his old rival one last time, Jonouchi is once again up against a God card player who has no problem with summoning it and forcing the duel to a matter of life or death. It's one of my favorite duels in the franchise, and if this were canon, would have been the perfect send-off for Jonouchi's character arc. Excellent mix between his original duel with Keith back in Duelist Kingdom and his Battle City semi-final duel against Dark Marik. Another highlight of R is the artwork. Ito not only does a fantastic job at mimicking Takahashi's art, but also spinning his own flavor as well. R has a really cool futuristic aesthetic, from the setting being Kaiba Corp's offices to how the story itself involves the usage of the holo technology found in the dual discs themselves, to the fact that nearly all the card professors are named after Intel CPUs. It's an interesting choice and it helps R stand out. So overall, do I recommend reading Yu-Gi-Oh! R? Kind of. If you're a fan of the original Yu-Gi-Oh! Manga, which I don't know why you would not be if you decide to watch this video, I guess you must really like my content? Then I don't see why not giving it a read. R is a non-stop barrage of duels that's ultimately a decent roller coaster ride that you can comfortably read in its entirety in an afternoon. It tells its story well enough, and its placement in the timeline means it works as either canon or non-canon, depending on if you enjoy what it adds or wish for it to be forgotten. But if you've never read Yu-Gi-Oh! Before or don't know what the series is, then I think you're better off reading the original manga to get an idea of why the series is so well beloved. But before I end this video, I'd like to pull the curtain back a little bit regarding my channel and its future. When I uploaded my video on the Yu-Gi-Oh! Manga 2 years ago, I was not expecting the reaction it got. I wasn't even expecting any kind of reaction at all, to be honest. I, like every other Yu-Gi-Oh! Fan, was genuinely devastated when I found out about Kazuki Takahashi's passing. I had no idea how to process it. It was one of the first times a celebrity death had impacted me so much. So I decided to take a chance and make a video about his work. But I didn't want to talk about the card game or the anime. Those were things he either supervised or had tertiary involvement with. And besides, there were hundreds of videos made by other people already. I wanted to talk about the piece of art that he worked on week after week, that he crafted by himself and spent countless nights on, his manga that he poured his soul towards, to show his love of gaming and to show people why our bonds with our friends, rivals, even the bonds of those that are no longer with us are so important. The manga that he almost fucking died working on. No, seriously, look it up. The manga that, for some reason, people didn't want to talk about properly. Any video about Yu-Gi-Oh's manga went like this. Wow, the original manga is really dark, guys. And that's it. I thought this was an injustice to the man and his work. The work that he put his life into. Even though I had experience making videos prior to this, this was the first time making a manga video, and to make one of such length on one topic was something I had never done before. There was a point, I believe, around the halfway point of editing the video where I'm going through the process of editing all the manga panels that I seriously almost gave up. It was taking so much out of me. I didn't know if I could finish the video or not. But eventually I just said fuck it and pushed through. By the time I was done, I was so happy with how the video turned out. Today, I can see the rough patches. My keyframing was too fast, my mic was way too amplified, and my background music was way too fucking loud. But I still enjoyed it for what it was, a video I poured my love and passion towards. It was honestly enough for me to be satisfied. But then a year ago, I don't know why, but the video suddenly just blew up. I woke up one day and saw comments pop up every hour, and the views were increasing with each day. I remember being so happy that the video reached 1,000 views. Now it's sitting at over 10,000. To say it honestly changed my life is not an exaggeration. But now that I've covered the manga, Dark Side of Dimensions, and now R, I feel like I've talked about everything there is to talk about in the original Yu-Gi-Oh series. Yeah, I could go over the individual story arcs and characters and make separate videos about them, but I don't want to milk what should have just been one video about Takahashi's work. And besides, it's clear with how popular my other videos are that people already see me more than just a Yu-Gi-Oh YouTuber. Maybe I'm finally done talking about Yu-Gi-Oh. Oh, who the hell am I fooling? I don't want to be known as just strictly the Yu-Gi-Oh guy on YouTube, but I want a part of the franchise to always be with my channel as a reminder of how my YouTube channel blew up in the first place. But I can't do this by myself, and that's why I'm setting up a subscriber milestone system. For each milestone I get, I will guarantee a video on the Yu-Gi-Oh spin-off that corresponds to it. 5,000 subscribers, I'll make a 5Ds video. 10,000 subscribers, I'll make a Zexal video. 50,000 subscribers, I'll make an Arc 5 video. And at 100,000 subscribers, I'll make a Vrains video. Assuming I reach all these goals year by year, that's going to be a 5-year long commitment, which I have no problem with. Trust me when I say that these videos are going to be even more in-depth than my original video on the manga. I'm going to go over each season, the characters, the duels, pacing, what works, and what doesn't. It's going to be really exciting getting to go through each spin-off, especially since half of these I haven't seen before. But you might be asking yourself, what about a video on Yu-Gi-Oh! GX? Well, this announcement was originally going to include it, but since the original milestone for it was 1,000 subscribers, and well, I've already passed it, that means it's a guarantee now. That's also what the surprise for me getting 1,000 subs was if you've seen my update video. So come and join me next year, where we'll be heading to Duel Academy Island and enroll into the world of Yu-Gi-Oh! GX!